Chapter 5. Their first week of marriage went by much too quickly for Cissie's tastes. She loved getting to know Bob, and she loved every minute they spent together. Sunday afternoon he was watching the Bears play the Packers and rooting for the wrong team entirely, while Cissie sat beside him on the couch, her Kindle resting on his broad shoulder. They had agreed to not watch the game together, not wanting to cause friction in their marriage. Cissie read one of her favorite author's newest books, wincing every time Bob cheered. She'd check out the score of the game later, like she always did, but she didn't have a need to watch the actual game itself. They talked during commercials. "What time do you go into work?" she asked. 9 most days. "What about you?" He knew their schedules wouldn't mesh well, but he planned to do whatever was necessary to see her as much as he could. "I go in at noon and work till close every night but Wednesday. I participate in the karaoke on Wednesdays, so I'm technically off at 5:30, but everyone still comes to me with questions. I guess I could leave, but I'm not supposed to." Would they ever even see each other? Other than the weekends? "What time is close?" 10. 11 on Fridays. She knew the hours were long, but she was needed so she worked them. Bob frowned, looking over at her. "We're never going to see each other, except weekends and Wednesday nights. When you get home, I'll be sleeping." He quickly started thinking about how he could change his schedule to match hers. It shouldn't be hard, because the guys on nights all wanted to be on days. Cissie didn't like the sound of that at all. "We don't open till noon most days, so I can't really change my hours. I have a weekend manager, but he's got a real job during the week. I can talk to the sheriff, see if he'll put me on nights." He hated the idea of working nights, but he'd do it so their schedules could match, and they could spend more time together. He'd spent too many years working nights in Chicago to want to do them again, but he'd do anything for her. Cissie kissed his shoulder. "I'd like that, but I don't want to upset your schedule." "What would your hours be then?" She wanted to spend time with him, but didn't want to mess with his world. How could she do both? "Night shift is 3 to midnight, with an hour for lunch." She bit her lip. "Would it bother you to work the night shift?" "Obviously it's not your preference, or you'd already be doing it." She didn't want him to have to change for her, but she knew it would be impossible for her to change for him. The bowling alley hours needed to remain as they were. "It won't bother me. I'm a night owl. I'll talk to the sheriff to have it done permanently, but there are always night shift guys who want to trade shifts." He would do anything to make her happy, and changing shifts was little enough. Of course, it would mean more time on traffic duty, but he could handle that. He would hate missing karaoke though. "It's probably too late to change shifts for this week, but starting next Monday, we can do that. If you really don't mind, that would be awesome. And this week, you can come hang out with me for karaoke, if you don't mind. Some of our local singers will make your ears bleed." She could think of one woman in particular who sang every week and was just terrible. Bob laughed. "I know. Some of them are god-awful." Cissie looked at him for a moment. "Have you been to karaoke at the Blevins Bowl?" She'd thought he looked too familiar for it to be just pulling Lachele over the night before the wedding. Could he have been someone she had seen on karaoke night? He nodded, suddenly nervous. Was she going to be upset with him? "Yeah. I've been going since late July." Hopefully she wouldn't ask anything else. He wouldn't lie to her, but neither would he volunteer information on how he'd gotten hooked up with Lachele. "So you knew who I was when we met?" "You already knew my name?" No one could be a regular for karaoke and not know her, because she was always introduced as the manager, and she sang the first song every single week. He wouldn't have hidden the fact that he knew who she was from her, would he? There was no logical reason for him to have done so. Unless there was something else he wasn't telling her. He took a deep breath and nodded, reaching out to stroke her cheek. "I wanted to approach you, but every time I tried, my tongue felt thick and my heart raced. Then I started blushing. I asked Trey about you the first night I saw you. He watched her face carefully, hoping with everything inside him that she wouldn't get angry with him. Cissie pulled back from him, looking at him as if she'd never seen him before. You mean, you know Trey? He'd acted like he was seeing Trey for the first time when she'd introduced them the week before. Why would he do that? What would he possibly stand to gain by pretending not to know Trey? He scrubbed his hands over his face, knowing it was time to come clean and tell her everything. Just hear me out, Cissie, and I'll tell you how this happened. He didn't want the anger he knew would come from his deception, but if he waited longer, it would surely get worse. Better to get it over with. Cissie kept her face impassive instead of throwing something at him as she wanted to. What the heck? Had he known he was marrying her while she was left in the dark? How fair was that? Go on. She knew her anger was leaking into her voice just a bit, but she couldn't hide it any longer. He looked down at his hands, his voice low. He was afraid to look at her as he explained exactly what he'd done. I talked to Trey that first night and asked for your phone number. If I'd had the guts to approach you that night, I think I would have been all right, but I was on a blind date, and I didn't think I should ask you out while I was there with another woman. He paused, sneaking a look at her. She looked angry. There was no way he was going to be able to explain this to her satisfaction. When I came back the next week, I flagged Trey down again, and we sat and talked for a few minutes. He told me about Lachele and gave me her phone number. He tried to make it clear that Trey wasn't at fault for what had happened, but he knew she'd blame the other man. He didn't want there to be friction between her and her best friend because of him. Cissie felt hurt deep in her gut. So Trey, Cindy, and Lachele were all part of this? Trey and Lachele were one thing, but Cindy? If Cindy had been involved with deceiving her, she was certain her heart would break. It would truly be beyond her comprehension. Bob shook his head emphatically. Not Cindy. At least, I don't think she had any idea. He didn't know for certain whether Trey had told his wife anything, but his gut said he hadn't. Cindy hadn't given him knowing looks at the wedding or when they'd seen her the next day. Surely she was innocent of all involvement. I'll find out for myself if Cindy knew anything. Go on. Cissie didn't want to hear any more, but she knew she needed to. She had to know who all was involved so she could deal with it. Out of the corner of his eye, Bob saw the Bears make a touchdown, and he shut off the TV with the remote he still held. So I called Lachele, and she told me she didn't set people up the way I was asking for. You see, I was willing to go through Matchrimony with no problem, but only if she'd interview me with you in mind. I didn't want anyone else. He didn't add that he would have flat refused to be matched with anyone but Cissie, but he was certain his unspoken words were understood. Cissie took a deep breath, trying to control her emotions. Was she married to some creepy stalker type? And what had Lachele been smoking to agree to this nonsense? So we're not really a match? That was almost the hardest thing for her to deal with about it all. She'd thought the man in front of her was her soul mate, the man who was meant for her. To find out he wasn't after they'd had the most wonderful week of marriage she could imagine, was heart-wrenching. Bob moved closer to her on the couch, trying to put an arm around her, but she shrugged him off. That's the deal, Cissie. We are a match. I had to go through 16 hours of interview and tests, when most people only do 12. I had to take all these different tests to make sure I wasn't some kind of freak. She even made me sign something so she could talk to my doctors and the department shrink in Chicago. Everything was fine. She told me if she had one tiny little worry that we wouldn't be right together, she would nix the whole thing. But she didn't. More than anything, he needed her to understand that they really were meant for each other. They belonged together, and Dr. Lachele had come to that conclusion herself. Cissie looked at him then, fire in her eyes. So while I was sitting there, following every single rule Matchrimony has. You knew who you were marrying, what I looked like, and could investigate on your own. My dad was freaked out about this, and you got to know all the time? Where is the fairness in that, Deputy Bob? She spit the name out, so annoyed with him she almost couldn't see straight. Bob sighed. Lachele told me you'd react this way when you found out. He wished he could have held out just a little longer, to give her time to fall in love with him. Now, it would never happen. He wished he knew of a magical band-aid he could put on their relationship. He wouldn't change what he'd done, but maybe if he could change the way she'd found out. And you went through with it anyway? What were you thinking? She didn't wait for a response. Instead, she jumped to her feet and grabbed her purse from the table next to the front door. I'll be back later. She left, slamming the door behind her. Never in her life had she felt quite so betrayed. Asterisk. Bob stared at the door for a moment, before burying his face in his hands. He'd screwed up by telling her so soon. But when he'd slipped, he knew he needed to tell her everything. He sat in total silence for a while, having no idea how much time had passed. He knew he needed to do something to get her back, but what could he do? He didn't even know where she'd gone. Finally, he grabbed his phone and called Lachele. Lachele, this is Bob. So how's my favorite newlywed? Still as madly in love as you were a couple of months ago? Bob sighed heavily. I am. But I messed up. I let it slip that I'd been to karaoke, and had to tell her everything. Let's just say she's not happy. She left. He quietly explained about the argument they'd had and how it had all come out. Left? You mean she left you? Or that she left for a little while to calm down? She said she'd be back later. He just wished he knew if she was coming back simply to get her things or to continue on as man and wife. He said a prayer of thanks for the contract they'd signed, promising to stay together for a full year. Well, good. I'm sure I'll need to talk to her then. Girl's got a temper when she's betrayed, and she's got to feel betrayed. Lachele paused for a moment. I'll call her in the morning. What should I do? Bob felt like an idiot for having to ask, but he didn't know what else to do. He thought about calling Cindy, but he had a feeling Cindy was either dealing with Cissie right then, or about to be dealing with her. Back off for a bit. Let her remember what she likes about you. You two were a stronger match than I've ever seen. She'll get over it. Maybe not as quickly as you'd like, and she'll be wary for a while, but she will get over it. Bob rubbed the back of his neck. Thanks. He hung up the phone, wishing he had a better answer. He didn't want to back off. He loved Cissie, and he wanted to shout it from the rooftops. Asterisk. Cissie pulled into the driveway of Cindy's Band B, still so angry she wanted to strangle someone. The first thing she needed to do was make sure Cindy hadn't been involved. If she was, she knew the feelings of betrayal would be much worse. Already she wanted to give in to the emotions and yell and cry, but she couldn't until she knew everything. She ran up to the door and pounded her fist a couple of times, waiting for her friend to answer. When Cindy came to the door, her hair was tousled, as if Cissie had interrupted some marital fun. For once, Cissie didn't care. She grabbed her friend's hand and pulled her out of the house. We need to talk. You know I hate conversations that start that way. Cindy looked a bit frightened. Why are you so upset? Did you and Bob have a fight? Cissie walked away from the house, toward the open field next to it that in a month would be filled with snow and the snowmobile Cindy and Bob had been fixing up for months. Bob just told me something that has me really pissed off, and I need to ask you about it. Did you have any idea that Trey gave Bob Lachele's number so she could set us up? Cissie watched Cindy's face carefully as she asked the question, knowing Cindy would never be able to lie to her. He did what? Cindy stopped walking and turned to Cissie. Tell me you're kidding, Because I don't want to have to kill my husband. Cissie sighed. Bob said you weren't involved, but I was afraid to believe him. She knew Cindy couldn't lie to save her life, so she believed her, finally feeling like she had an ally. She didn't know how she'd have handled it if she'd found out Cindy had been part of the duplicity. Cindy had always been on her side in everything. Cindy hugged Cissie tight. You know me better than that. I'm not involved. Now, you need to tell me everything we know, so we can go and tell my husband the reasons for his execution. With a glare toward the house, Cissie explained everything to Cindy, watching as her friend's face got redder and redder. When she was finished, she asked, What do you think? I think, if it wouldn't hurt me so much, we'd need to go cut off the man's tallywhacker. Cindy shook her head, obviously upset. Let's go talk to him. See what he has to say for himself. Cindy linked arms with Cissie and began walking toward the house, anger visible on her face. She opened the front door and wandered through the house to his office. Trey looked back and forth between the two of them, his eyes widening. Cindy threw him a lap quilt to cover up with, because he was wearing only his boxers as usual. You need to cover yourself. Your tallywhacker is in danger. She crossed her arms over her chest and glared at him. Trey covered himself up, making certain there was a double layer over his private parts. What did I do this time? Cissie glared at him. When did you first meet Bob, Trey? She needed to know if he'd admit the truth or if he was a lying piece of scum. If he was a lying piece of scum, then he wasn't good enough for Cindy, whether they were already married or not. Trey closed his eyes, obviously worried about where the conversation was going. July. Less than a week after I married Cindy. Cindy took a couple of steps forward. How long had you known him before you gave him Lachele's number? Without ever once mentioning to me you were helping him deceive me and my best friend. Trey had real fear in his eyes as he looked up at Cindy. A week. A week? Have you lost your ever-loving mind? Cindy's hands were clenched at her sides. Do you really think that's an appropriate amount of time to know someone before you betray your wife for him? I would have thought you'd wait at least a month. I didn't look at it as betraying either of you. He took a deep breath, obviously trying to come up with the right words. I knew Cissie was looking for love, and I knew Lachele had the ability to weed out anyone she shouldn't be with. So I gave him a leg up by giving him Lachele's number. That's all. I didn't call Lachele and put in a good word for him or anything. And that makes it better? Cissie asked, her voice loud and angry. Do you really think that makes it okay? Trey sighed. I don't know if it makes it better, but I wasn't trying to hurt you or deceive you. I just wanted you to be happy, and I could see from the way Bob looked at you, he'd be a good loving husband. You didn't think calling a matchmaker just to set us up was a bit stalkery? I'm half afraid to go home. Cissie exclaimed, knowing it was a lie even as the words crossed her lips. Yes, she was angry, and yes, she wanted Trey to feel everything she was feeling, but Bob wouldn't hurt her. He cared for her. She had no doubts about that. Are you really afraid to go home? Trey asked. Because I can tell you, that man would do anything for you. He's not a stalker. He took one look at you and knew he was in love. Period. Without ever speaking to me? That's stalkery. But no, I'm not really afraid to go home. Cissie sighed, collapsing on the couch in the office. I do feel very betrayed by you and Lachele though. I'll talk to her tomorrow. She looked at Cindy. I think your wife is even angrier than I am. I am, Cindy confirmed, her eyes on Trey. How could you? Trey looked down at his hands. I wasn't thinking about how you would feel about it. Have you never met someone and wanted to help them? Wanted to do something nice for them? Cindy frowned. Well, sure I have, but not at the expense of my friends. And is it at her expense? Really? Trey looked at Cissie. Are you happy? Or were you before you found out you'd been manipulated, for lack of a better word? Cissie nodded. I was. I'm not sure how I feel now, but I was. Then you can be again. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Look, I know you're mad at me now. And you're mad at Bob and Lachele, and I understand why. But if Bob is the man who is going to make you happy, don't you think you can look past all that and forgive us all? Cissie looked at Cindy, who was still looking angry, but contemplative at the same time. I'm going to drive around a little more and think. Cindy? You deal with him. If you need to borrow handcuffs and a nightstick, Bob has them at home. She glared at Trey one more time, letting him know he still wasn't totally off the hook. She'd let Cindy deal with him, though. It was her job. At Cindy's yelp of laughter, she got up and walked to the door. Cindy hurried along behind her. Are you going to be okay? Yeah, I'll be fine. It's just weird to realize that the world is different than I thought it was. Bob has never been anything but kind, affectionate, and loving. I need to figure out how to go forward is all. Cindy hugged Cissie. You'll figure things out while I deal with Trey. She shook her head. I'm so sorry about his part in all this. You did nothing wrong. It's that man Lachele chose for you. We'll blame Lachele. That woman is going to get a piece of my mind when I call her tomorrow. Cindy grinned. Glad I'm not in her shoes. Cissie laughed, surprised to hear the sound. An hour before, she'd thought laughing wouldn't happen for a while. Asterisk. Cissie drove around for a few hours, admiring the changing leaves. She loved fall in Wisconsin, even though it meant winter would soon be upon them. Wisconsin was breathtaking in every season, but to her, fall was the best. She loved to drive through the hilly regions, just being mesmerized by the scenery. When she finally turned toward home, it was dark. The game had been on at noon, so she knew she'd been gone far longer than she should have been. She'd forgotten her phone, so she'd heard from no one, which was both good and bad. Good, because she'd truly needed the time to think, but bad, because she knew Bob would be worried. No matter how angry she was with the man, she didn't want him worrying about her. She pulled into the driveway of their house and got out of her car. Before she even made it to the front door, Bob was rushing out to greet her, grabbing her close and burying his face in her hair. Are you all right? Cissie nodded. Yeah. I'm good. Sorry to worry you. She was surprised to hear herself say the words, but even more surprised when she realized she truly felt them. He took her arm and led her toward the house. I made a big pot of soup, so you could eat whenever you got home. He was officially off cooking duty, but he'd do it forever if it kept her anger at bay. Thank you. She sat at the table in the kitchen while he ladled soup into bowls for each of them. I called Trey, and he said you'd left hours ago. I knew you were angry, and all I could see was your car wrapped around a tree. I was afraid to go out looking for you, but I was on the phone repeatedly with the state patrol, having them check for wrecks. Cissie felt terrible. Her anger aside, she shouldn't have caused him worry like that, not knowing how worried he was about losing people. I'm sorry. Bob shook his head. I understand. I really do. Did you sort things out in your mind? That was at the heart of everything for him. No matter how much he'd worried, if the time away had allowed her to wrap her brain around the circumstances behind their wedding, then it was all worth it. She nodded. You know, as angry as I was, I do understand why you did it. His eyes met hers, and he took her hand in his. Really? Yeah, really. I wish you'd just approached me like a normal human being, but I can understand why you didn't. She took a bite of the soup, closing her eyes as the flavors exploded on her tongue. He was an excellent cook. Promise you won't hide things from me again. He nodded slowly. I won't. He thought of Chain Aid and what had happened in Chicago, but that had all happened before he knew who she was. Cissie wasn't asking for full disclosure of everything that had ever happened to him, was she? I left Cindy to deal with Trey, and I'll be calling Lachele tomorrow. She's the one I feel the most betrayed by. Bob took her hand in his. Don't. She argued with me for hours before she'd agree to even talk to me. Her exact words were, "Good gravy, boy. I don't do that." He hoped hearing the older woman's words would soothe Cissie a bit. Cissie grinned. She could just hear Lachele saying that to him. But you convinced her. Seriously, Cissie. It took 4 hours. And I went through every test known to man. She knows about every speeding ticket I've ever had. The woman was fanatical in her quest. I bet you could call her and find out the name of every teacher I've had since kindergarten. She really went overboard. He had been annoyed by all the extra testing and questioning at the time, but now that he could defend the matchmaker with everything she'd done, he was pleased. Good. She needed to do something to make it right. Cissie took a sip of water. Did you feel violated before she was done? He nodded slowly. In a lot of ways, yes. It was weird giving someone permission to find out every single detail of my life. He shook his head. She even talked to my doctor to find out if I'd ever had a STD. Cissie laughed. And have you? He shook his head. Nope. She took another bite of soup. So Lachele knows all about past relationships too, I guess. Yeah. I bet Lachele could give you the date of my conception, circumcision, and the day I lost my virginity in the backseat of my car in high school. He had almost felt mind-raped by the time she was done. He couldn't help but wonder which parts of her inquisition had been normal and which had been just for him. What was her name? Cissie asked, a gleam in her eye. Whose name? Bob wasn't following. Cissie knew Lachele's name. The girl you lost your virginity to in the back seat of your car. What was her name? Did men remember things like that? Bob grinned. I should have known you'd focus on that. He shook his head at her, feeling amused all of a sudden. Do you even remember her name? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Of course, I do. Almost as well as I remember her breasts. He gazed off into space as if remembering something. Her name was Lola Riggs. She'd been his steady girlfriend for his last year of high school and his first semester of college. They were Facebook friends, and he was always amused by the pictures of her children. Cissie glared. And her breasts were somehow more memorable than mine, I take it? Was he insulting her breasts in some way? She'd never had complaints about them before. Only in that they were the first I ever touched with no bra on. There were other girls, but I had to stay over the shirt with them. He shrugged. I'm sure you understand. He thought about all the dating rules different girls had given him in high school and almost laughed out loud. He was glad he'd met Cissie as his wife and hadn't had to go through the dating nonsense with her. So, how many girls were there before me? I saved myself for our wedding night. Sounds like you weren't quite so pure. She pierced him with her eyes waiting for an answer. Bob sighed. There were only 2, Lola was the only girl in high school. Tanya was college, and then we lived together for a few years after. We were engaged and almost married. We split about 3 years ago. There hasn't been anyone else. He'd been too busy picking up the pieces for there to be someone else. He'd been lost after he and Tanya split up, but it had nothing to do with his former fiancée. So you split not long before you moved here? Because you were moving here? Or did you move here because you split? How much had Tanya affected him? Was she the real love of his life? Neither one really. They were totally separate things. He didn't really want to talk about Tanya or the circumstances behind his move. He reached out and took her hand. Are we okay? She nodded slowly, feeling like she was letting him off the hook too easily, but her anger was gone. Yeah, we're okay. He took her hand and brought it to his lips. I was worried I'd ruined everything earlier. I was too. I realized that we care about each other, though, and it's just not right to throw it all away for nothing. No matter how angry Cissie became, she didn't burn bridges. She may slowly drift away from someone, but if they were a good person, she tried to mend fences. You care for me? He asked, a bit surprised. Of course I do. I don't sleep with just anyone, you know. She teased, getting up and walking around the table to him. I'm not like you. Hey. 3 girls is not a lot, you know. She sank into his lap, kissing him. I guess not. Seems like a lot to me, though. He sighed. And you wonder why I never tell you anything. Chapter 6. Cissie woke from a sound sleep, hearing Bob mumble. She turned to him. Bob? What's wrong? The sounds he made sounded anguished. She wanted to help him, but had no idea how. No. Don't go in there. He sat bolt upright in bed, sweat dripping off his body. He reached out as if to grab someone to stop them. No. Stop. Cissie sat beside him, her hand touching his arm, shocked by how cold he felt. Are you all right? Bob nodded. Yeah, just a bad dream. Happens sometimes. He threw his legs over the side of the bed. I'm going to shower. Do you want company? She asked softly, worried about him. No, I'm fine. Go back to sleep. He wandered away toward the bathroom, and Cissie got up to strip the sheets from the bed. His side of the bed was soaked. Cissie waited for him in the dark, wondering how often he had dreams like this. She had a feeling he was used to them, though why she thought that, she wasn't sure. Maybe it was the way he automatically showered. When he came back from his shower, he slipped into bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark. Cissie moved closer to him, her head on his shoulder. Do you want to talk about it? About what? He asked. There was no way he'd talk about his dreams with Cissie. She would leave him, just like Tanya had. Your dream. I don't remember what it was about. He turned his back to her, closing his eyes tightly. He couldn't talk about what had happened with Chainaid. He couldn't. Cissie stared at his back in the dark for a moment, wondering what she'd done wrong. Why wouldn't he talk about his dream? She rolled to her side, facing away from him. She closed her eyes, hoping sleep would come. It was her first day back at work, and she knew it would be a busy one. Asterisk. Cissie got a call from Lachele as she was getting ready for work. Hi, Snickerdoodle. Lachele sounded as sweet as ever, but for the first time, Cissie was just annoyed by the other woman's voice. Don't you snickerdoodle me, Lachele. I can't believe you set me up with someone who requested me. Why would you do that? Is that even ethical? Cissie knew her voice was harsh, but she didn't care. She had a right to be angry, and she wasn't going to hide it from the woman she felt had betrayed her. I did more tests on him than anyone else. There's not a thing about that man I don't know. I even made him go see a doctor so I could be sure he was in working baby-making order for you. Lachele's voice was calm and reasonable. She'd obviously been expecting the attack. Cissie wondered who'd tipped her off. I don't want babies anytime soon. Cissie wasn't sure she ever wanted babies at this point, but if she did, not for a few years at least. But when you do want them, you know he's not shooting blanks. I did more for you than I have for any other woman I've matched. You can't say I haven't. Lachele sounded sad. I really thought he might be the right man for you, sweetie. And after all the tests said he was, I couldn't not set you up with him. You could have introduced us like normal people so we could be on even ground. He knew everything about me going into our marriage, and I knew nothing about him. He's a good man, Cissie. Are you still angry with him? Cissie sighed. He is a good man, and no, I'm not still angry with him. Just with you. And she could feel that anger rapidly dissipating. She needed to take a class in how to stay mad at someone. Cindy could stay mad for months without it bothering her a bit. Maybe Cindy could teach the class. Don't be mad. I really did what I thought was the best thing for you. He loves you. Cissie wrinkled her nose at that. I don't know about love. He doesn't know me well enough to love me. Lachele laughed. Normally, I'd agree with that, but Bob is something special. He really does love you. The sooner you believe that, the easier things will go for the two of you. Do you know why he has nightmares? Cissie asked, changing the subject. If Lachele had made such a careful study of Bob, then surely she could answer that simple question for her. Lachele was quiet for a moment. Yes, I do, but it's not my place to talk about it. Did you ask him? He said he couldn't remember the dreams. Keep asking him, Cupcake. He'll tell you. It's hard for him to talk about still. Cissie sighed. I feel like the whole world is in on all these big secrets about my husband except me. She hated being in the dark about anything. It made her feel helpless. He'll tell you when he's ready. It's nothing you need to worry about. I promise you that. Fine. Cissie glanced at the clock on the wall. I need to go. I'll miss having lunch with Cindy if I don't hurry. You don't want that. Give her a nice big booby bump for me. I will. Cissie pressed end and realized she'd forgiven Lachele already. She'd never really been one to hold a grudge. ***. Cissie's dad was waiting for her when she got to work. Hey, Dad. How'd everything go? She was more worried about how her new cook had done chasing after Ashley than anything else. She wouldn't ask though. If it had been a problem, her dad would surely say something. We had a good week. All except for Wednesday night karaoke. They expected me to sing the first song, and it was a bit of a disaster. Cissie was well aware of her dad's tenure. What did you sing? Her dad was a bad singer, but he wasn't nearly as bad as some of their karaoke regulars. Sweet Caroline. It's a classic. Cissie shook her head. But everyone sings it for karaoke. It should be banned from karaoke everywhere. She realized then she should have picked out a song for him. That would have made his week easier. Of course, with her dad's voice, she'd have chosen something like C is for Cookie. Her dad shrugged. Well, I've never done karaoke before. How was I supposed to know that? He studied his daughter. Your cop treating you right? He's a good man, Dad. Cissie wasn't about to mention the trouble they'd had when she found out about Bob deceiving her. Her dad would come unglued about that, and she didn't need him mad at her husband. I'm glad. He didn't look quite convinced. We're heading south next week. Your mom is ready to see some of the warmer places in the nation. All right. Cissie knew her parents were on a never-ending quest to avoid extreme weather, either hot or cold. Do you want to keep doing some of the late-night stuff this week? So I can have a little more time with my husband? She knew her dad missed running the bowling alley as much as she needed more time with Bob. Whatever that nightmare had been, she needed to be able to help him with it. He thought about it for a minute before nodding. If you'll work late on Wednesday, I'll be in by 5 the other nights this week. Cissie threw her arms around her father. Thanks, Dad. He held her close. Just so you're happy. That's all I want. I'm going to make lunch for Cindy and me. Do you want to eat with us? Cindy was like a second daughter to her father, so it wouldn't be unusual for him to join them. Absolutely not. I know how you girls talk, and I do not want that much insight into your new marriage. I know you'll be a virgin until you're 87, and that's all that matters to me. Cissie grinned as he walked away, toward the door of the bowling alley. She'd let him keep lying to himself for as long as he wanted to. They both knew better, but if it made him feel better to pretend, she wasn't about to disillusion him. At the door, he turned to wave. I'll be here at 5. Thanks, Dad. She couldn't have asked for a better father. Cissie rushed into the kitchen to get lunch started. When Cindy arrived 20 minutes later, she seemed almost afraid to approach Cissie. Everything all right? Cissie nodded. You know I can't hold a grudge. Good thing for everyone involved. Cindy sighed. It is. Did you make your peace with Lachele? Of course. She was trying to do the best thing for me, blah blah blah. Sometimes I wish people would let me decide what the best thing for me is. She shrugged. Good news though. Dad is going to work every night this week except Wednesday, and really I can leave early on Wednesday as long as I sing the first song for karaoke. Oh, that's nice. So you'll at least get to see Bob a bit. He's going to try to have his schedule adjusted for next week, so we'll be getting off work at the same time. She briefly thought about mentioning Bob's bad dream, but she realized there was a line about what she could talk to her best friend about, and that was crossing it. Is that good or bad? Do you still feel like he's all weird and stalkery? Cindy studied her friend. Cissie shook her head. You know, I never really felt that way. It just felt like a betrayal of sorts. I've talked to Lachele, and I just can't stay mad at that purple-haired freak. Bob and I are good. Trey still has his tallywhacker, I assume? So far. Should he still have it? Cissie shrugged. Yeah, I'll get over it. It was just annoying that things were hidden from me that I had a right to know. I'll live. She hoped she'd caused a big enough stink that no one would try to play that kind of mind game with her again. I know you will. I'm just trying to figure out if we're still mad at our husbands, or if Trey is allowed to come back to bed tonight. You're the best friend a girl could ever have, you know that? Cissie squeezed Cindy's hand before applying herself to her lunch. Did you really kick him out of bed? Cindy sighed. I thought about it, but then I couldn't figure out why I should punish myself. Cissie grinned. I appreciate you even considering making that kind of sacrifice for me. I promise you, if a giant chocolate kiss ran into the bowling alley right now, I'd let you sniff the wrapper when I was done eating it. That's the kind of friend I am. I appreciate that about you, Cindy. What would I do without you? Honestly, you'd probably get a lot more chocolate. Cissie nodded. So true. Asterisk. Cissie thought about texting Bob that she'd be home early, but she decided to surprise him instead. When she got to the house, his SUV was out front, so she called out to him as she walked in the front door. Honey, I'm home. She did her best to sound like a sitcom husband. Bob stuck his head out of the kitchen where he was still in his uniform. What are you doing here so early? Not that I'm complaining. He rushed from the kitchen to kiss her, a grin on his face. I do like a man in uniform. Cissie took a step back and skimmed her eyes down him from head to toe. All I can think about is taking that uniform off you, Deputy Bob. She loved the way his shoulders looked in his uniform. You should really wear that even on your days off. I like it so much. He looked down at her. So it doesn't really matter what I look like or who I am, as long as I'm wearing a uniform? Cissie's hands rubbed his shoulders. No, I think I like the uniform a bit extra, because of the man inside it. She winked up at him. Do you now? He leaned down and kissed her again, his hands gripping her through the jeans that molded her bottom. I like you in your jeans. What are you doing home so early? Did you miss me so much you couldn't stay away? She grinned, nipping his neck softly. My dad is going to come in at 5 every day except Wednesday, so I can come home early. Just this week, but it gives us a bit more time together. Time for him to tell her about his bad dreams, she hoped. Bob grinned. I'll take it. You don't really have a choice. Until Mom and Dad are on the road again, you're stuck with me. Well, he was stuck with her forever, but she wasn't about to tell him that just then. He already had bad dreams. Like glue? Or more like being handcuffed together? Cissie tilted her head to the side thinking about it. Probably more like glue. Really strong glue, the kind that only really works on human skin. She sighed. I'm hungry. Bob blinked at her abrupt change of subject for a moment. I was just about to make myself a couple of sandwiches for dinner. How does that sound? Grilled cheese? Cissie wasn't a huge fan of cold sandwiches, but she loved a good grilled cheese. Oh, a grilled cheese with ham on it. She could already taste it. He grinned at her. Are you going to cook? She had yet to cook for him. He was joking just to see her reaction. She sighed. Yeah, I can cook. She walked to the kitchen sink and washed her hands. Do you want ham on yours? Yes, please. He hadn't expected her to agree to cook, but when she had, he wasn't going to argue with her. I'll go change while you cook. Cissie turned and looked at him. Leave that on for a while longer, would you? She didn't want to give up looking at him in his uniform just yet. Maybe she was strange, but she liked it way too much. He laughed. You really do like my uniform. Oh, deputy, if only you knew. She grinned at him over her shoulder as she sliced several pieces of cheddar cheese off a big block. While they ate, they talked about their day. The sheriff was able to find me someone to switch shifts with me starting Monday, so that's taken care of. I will miss watching you on Wednesday nights, though. He got a thrill out of watching her sing before they were married. How would it be now when he knew he was coming home to her? Why don't you come in for your lunch break? Can you make it around 6? That's the time I always sing. She suddenly felt like she needed him there watching her. She didn't know where that feeling came from, but she hoped she wasn't turning into one of those clingy wives. He shook his head. It needs to be more like 7 or so. Well, then I'll sing at 7 as well. She would start planning for the song she'd sing that week. It had to be something special just for him. That would work. I'd love to be there for it. Are you going to come for karaoke this week? You don't have to stay the whole time. She really liked the idea of singing for him, knowing he was there listening. Yes, she'd sung for him many times, but she hadn't known she was singing for him. Now she would know. He nodded. Wouldn't miss it. He took a bite of his sandwich. This is really good. I thought you couldn't cook. First of all, that's a grilled cheese, not exactly culinary greatness. Second, I never said I couldn't cook. I said I don't like to cook. Big difference. I help out in the kitchen at the bowling alley all the time. When I'm not waiting tables or renting shoes or doing paperwork. I don't want to have to cook at home as well. I can understand that. I'll plan on cooking most meals. She shrugged. I can get behind that. I'll cook sometimes, but only when you're least expecting it or I'm craving something. That works. He reached across the table for her hand. I'm glad your dad is going to cover for you in the evenings this week. Should make life much more pleasant. She laughed. More exciting probably. Especially if you wear your uniform. He shook his head. You and your uniform fetish. How will I ever know if you want me for myself and not just the uniform I wear? Cissie tilted her head to the side for a moment, pretending to contemplate his question. It's probably best if you always wear it around me, so we never need to find out for certain. Asterisk. Bob woke up in a cold sweat again, shouting. Don't go in there. Wait for me. His whole body was shaking. Cissie reached out and put her hand on his shoulder. Bob, you're dreaming again. Are you all right? Do you want to talk about it? She wanted to help him, but she knew he wasn't going to let her. Why couldn't he just tell her what the problem was? He shook his head adamantly, jumping out of bed. Going to get a shower. He shut the bathroom door behind him with a snap. He hated himself for upsetting her, but he knew she could never understand. As the water washed over him, he leaned his head against the wall. The nightmares were worse all of a sudden, and he had no idea why. He was happier than he'd thought he could be, except for the dreams that haunted him. He thought back over every detail of the dream, reliving the night Sinead had died. Sinead had been his partner for only 3 months, a rookie fresh from the academy. She was a young black woman, barely old enough to wear a badge, but so full of life, she'd made every day more pleasant. She'd recently gotten engaged, and he and his fiancée, Tanya, had attended her engagement party just days before. They'd been on their way to dinner at a little diner in the middle of Chicago, where all the cops ate together. The owner gave a 20% discount to police officers, knowing it was the best way to make certain he'd be the last restaurant to be robbed. I want to listen to music for a change. All we ever do is listen to this stupid, boring dispatcher. Sinead glared at him. Bob had stopped at a light, looking at her like she'd lost her mind. You do know we're cops, and the only way we know when someone is in trouble is if the dispatcher tells us, right? How many times did he have to explain it to her? If they missed the dispatcher, people could die. There was no time in a cop's workday for music. I'll play the music low. She'd propped her phone onto the console of the car, setting it to her iTunes selections. I love 80s music, don't you? Bob merely grunted. He didn't think they should be listening to music at all while on duty, but Sinead and her attitude were contagious. It wasn't long before he was laughing at her car dancing. You know, people can see in our windows. What are they going to think about cops dancing around like crazy people in their cars? She frowned. Maybe I should blast the music and roll down the windows so they know what we're listening to. If they could hear Billy Joel, they'd start dancing too. It's a moral necessity to dance when you hear him singing. He shook his head. Really? I seem to be able to resist. Bob, you're a fuddy-duddy. You need to have fun with your job. Stop being so serious. She turned the music up a little louder and continued her car dance. The dispatcher cut in. All available units on the southeast side, there is an armed robbery in progress at. Sinead snapped to attention and shut off her music. That's us. Let's go. Bob flipped the lights on and took a U-turn at the next intersection, ignoring the young kid who flipped him off. Sinead grabbed the radio and responded, giving their location and estimated time of arrival. As soon as she put the radio down, Bob told her, "Wait in the car until I can go in with you." No heroics. Sinead was a bit of a hothead and ran into dangerous situations without thinking first. Bob couldn't let her risk herself. She was too much like a kid sister to him. They were the first on scene, and while Bob was putting the car in park, Sinead rushed out of the car, going in before taking the time to draw her gun. Bob was less than 30 seconds behind her, just long enough to see her dive to cover a small child who was crying. The perpetrator had his gun pointed at the child. I told you to shut up. His gun went off, and Bob didn't blink before shooting him. Twice. When the man dropped, he turned and saw Sinead slumped over the little girl over a display of bottled water. Che. He crouched beside her, checking his partner's pulse. He slowly lowered her off the frightened girl, who couldn't have been more than 6, and was wailing more loudly than before. The child was covered with blood, but none of it seemed to be hers. Are you all right? He asked softly. Mommy, she cried, pointing toward the back of the store. Bob closed his eyes, trying to block out Sinead's lifeless body. "I'll go see if she's okay. You wait here." He held his gun up, half expecting to see another perp, but instead he found a woman on the floor of the convenience store. She was unconscious, but alive. He pulled the radio off his shoulder, asking for 3 ambulances. He knew it was too late for Sinead, but he refused to believe it. Just minutes ago, she'd been full of life. She couldn't be dead. It wasn't possible. Minutes later, the ambulances were there, along with many police cars for backup. Bob held it together, helping the man behind the counter back to his feet. It wasn't until hours later, when he'd arrived home and explained to Tanya what had happened, that he'd fallen apart. Tanya, the girl he'd thought to spend the rest of his life with, had only responded with anger because he'd been late coming home, and he hadn't called. It was the beginning of the end for them. She hadn't been able to deal with his nightmares about Sinead or his seemingly endless visits to the department shrink. She'd been angry about his leave of absence, telling him he needed to man up. She'd only stayed for 2 months after the incident, refusing to be with a man who couldn't deal with reality. When he'd tried to return to duty in Chicago, he'd been gripped by the sadness that came with losing someone close to him. He hadn't been able to do his job properly. Not wanting to give up being a cop, he'd talked to the shrink yet again, and it had been his idea to go to a small town somewhere. It was the perfect solution. 3 months later, he'd been in Wisconsin. The nightmares had eased off to the point he was only having 1 or 2 a month. He could live with that. Bob sighed, shutting off the water. He'd have to call the department shrink in the morning. His nightmares had come back with a vengeance, and he needed help dealing with them. Again. Chapter 7. Cissie woke earlier than usual the following morning, and she was alone in bed. She started toward the kitchen to see where Bob was, hoping they could talk for a minute before she left. When she stood in the hallway, she could hear his voice, and he sounded upset. "The nightmares are getting worse again. I thought I had this mostly licked, Doc." There was a pause as he waited for a reply. "Changed in my life? Yeah, I got married, but it can't have anything to do with Cissie. She's awesome." She could hear Bob moving around in the kitchen. It sounded like he was pouring himself a cup of coffee. "No, I haven't told her." "How could I?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah, I know, but when I told Tanya, she left me. I love Cissie." Cissie leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. He wouldn't want her listening to his conversation, she knew, but obviously he was talking about his nightmares and something he didn't want her to know about. Why was he hiding something from her? "I guess I could start seeing a shrink here, but I'd rather not." "You really think talking to her about it would kill the nightmares?" "I don't think so. I'd just start having nightmares that she'd leave me." That was enough for Cissie. She walked silently back to the bedroom and jumped in the shower. He was hiding something major from her, and she needed to know what it was. She'd tried to get Lachele to tell her, but she wouldn't. Who would then? After her shower, she found Bob and kissed him goodbye, noticing that he looked strained. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" He just looked at her, not responding to that. "Have a good day. I'll see you this evening. I started chili in the crock pot." He left without another word, closing the door firmly behind him. Cissie wanted to kick something. What was wrong with the man? He obviously cared about her, but there was something he was desperately afraid to tell her. Hadn't he learned yet that full disclosure was the way to keep her from getting angry? She walked into the kitchen and poured herself a cup of coffee, picking up her phone. "Hey, Cindy. Is Trey around? I have a question for him." When Trey got on the phone, she didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "You know you owe me, right? For keeping a big secret from me?" Starting the conversation that way would make him more willing to talk. She was sure of it. Trey sighed. Of course. What do you want? My firstborn? He sounded annoyed, but he agreed. No, I don't like kids a whole lot. What do you know about Bob's past? Do you know why he has nightmares? She knew asking wasn't the right thing to do, but she felt like he'd left her with no options. Huh? Bob has nightmares? He doesn't seem like the type at all. His voice was baffled. Cissie sighed. Okay. That's all I needed. She frowned. Now what? Wait. Trey, are you still there? Yeah. Will you ask him about them? Not specifically, but ask him about his past. Figure out what's going on. I need to know. She knew she was asking for a lot, but she felt like he owed it to her. Trey sighed heavily. I have no idea how I'd go about doing that. You don't just go up to another guy and ask if he has nightmares. Cissie sighed. I know that. Tell him you're having nightmares and see if he volunteers. Cissie? No. You need to ask him yourself. Fine. She hung up the phone, drinking more of her coffee. Lachele had already refused to tell her, but she obviously knew. Why did everyone feel the need to keep the wife in the dark? She thought of little else at work that day. She did her paperwork and ran around like a crazy woman as usual, but she couldn't stop worrying about Bob. Why wouldn't he tell her? What could he have done that would make him worried she'd leave him, but still let him be a cop? When she got home that evening, they had the chili he'd made, and she was once again impressed by his culinary prowess. After dinner, she did the dishes, before suggesting they go for a walk. He shrugged. He seemed to her like someone had sucked the life out of him. She couldn't help but worry. He wasn't sleeping well because of the nightmares, and he was obviously worried she'd leave him while he was awake. They had to talk it out. She pulled on a light jacket emblazoned with the emblem of the Green Bay Packers, and he pulled on one with the Chicago Bears. You need a real jacket, she joked. I'm getting you Packers apparel for Christmas. Then you won't have to worry about getting lynched. You're a disgrace. Bob just rolled his eyes, smiling slightly at her. Won't wear it. He didn't care if he lived in Wisconsin now, he would always be true to the Bears. It was bad enough he'd married a Packers fan. He'd never guessed he'd be part of a mixed marriage. They walked hand in hand through the quiet streets. The bars were in the middle of town, but it was hours before closing time, so there was no real traffic. The population wasn't even big enough to have a convenience store. I love how the air smells in the fall. People are starting to use their fireplaces, and you can smell the wood burning. She looked up at the sky. It's a pretty night. She loved looking at the stars, and thought for the 100th time in her life that she should learn where the constellations were. He nodded. Her enthusiasm was infectious, as always. Her joy in life floored him at times. She was so different than Tanya, but so like Sinead. You always see the good side of everything. Cissie grinned. Not always, but I try. People who dwell on the negative only make themselves and everyone around them miserable. She shrugged. Sometimes it's hard, but it's worth it. He frowned. Have you never been depressed? Maybe a little when I was in high school. Isn't everyone? I wasn't one of the most popular girls in school. Probably because I preferred to stay home and read romance novels instead of going to parties. He laughed. I went to every party I was invited to. Really? You were a wild child? She couldn't picture him as a partier. He shrugged. Not really. I played sports, so I didn't drink or do drugs, but I liked to dance, and I really liked the girls. I'm sure you did. You still do from what I can tell. Always thinking with that tallywhacker of yours. She shook her head. Bob burst out laughing. Tallywhacker? I don't think anyone's used that word in at least 30 years. Cindy says it's what Trey calls his. She shrugged. She knew nothing about what men called their penises. She had just been so amused by the word tallywhacker, she'd had to use it. Seeing him laugh filled her with joy. Bob stopped walking and pulled her to him for a kiss. Every day I fall in love with you a little bit more. Because I use the word tallywhacker? Because you remind me that no matter what's happened, what regrets you have, there's always something worth living for. He kissed her again, softly. Thank you for that. Do you want to tell me about your regrets? She asked softly. I'll tell you one if you'll tell me one. Maybe they could make a game of it, and he would forget, and tell her his big secret. She knew there was regret in it somewhere. He frowned for a moment, but nodded. That sounds fair. He grabbed her hand again and kept walking. Cissie racked her brain for a real regret, but one that would be amusing at the same time. Okay, when I was in junior high, there was this boy named Dale. He was a jerk to everyone but me, but he liked me. I knew he liked me. The whole world knew he liked me. She shrugged. Well, anyway, I liked him back, but I was afraid to do anything about it. So one day I was walking home from school, and he came running up behind me, and he offered to carry my books. Bob nodded, listening. He could just picture her at that age, with a boy following her everywhere. Okay. Well, he didn't really offer, he just tried to take them from me. So I fought with him over the books and kept my math book. And then I hit him with it, just as hard as I could on his shoulder. She'd later heard that he'd told someone he wanted to carry her books, or she never would have understood what he was doing. He grinned. You were feisty even then, weren't you? My personality hasn't changed one bit. So anyway, he dropped my books and ran off, and he never liked me again. She lowered her voice to a whisper. I've heard he's a Vikings fan now, and I'm sure it's all because of what I did to him. The last words were spoken so solemnly it was as if he had died as a result of what she'd done. Bob threw back his head and laughed. I can see where you'd regret that forever. He thought hard. Okay, here's my regret. Remember that girl I told you about? Lola? The one who stole your virginity in the back seat of your car in high school? No, not at all. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders and kept walking. Well, when we graduated from high school, we were still hot and heavy. She went off to Notre Dame, and I went to the University of Chicago. He shrugged. We kept in touch for our first semester, emailing constantly. He whispered. Don't tell anyone, but I went to college without a cell phone. A few kids at school had them when he'd gone, but it had been before the rage where everyone had to have one. She laughed. I had one, but you're much older than me. Yeah, 8 whole years. He shook his head. Sometimes, for all her sweetness, she could be one of the most obnoxious women he knew. So anyway, we'd write every day at first, and then it got to be more like once a week. By Christmas vacation, I already had my eye on this other girl who went to school with me. But when we got home for Christmas vacation, I didn't tell Lola. I let her think everything was just the way it had been. I waited till she was away, and then I emailed her, telling her it was over between us. Instead of telling her in person? Wow. You probably should have just hired a skywriter. She could see that it wasn't the right thing to do, but it wasn't what was causing his nightmares. Yeah, it was cold. He frowned. Okay, I'll go again. Let me think. They walked to a small park and went in. They each took a swing and faced each other as they talked, seeing well by the full moon. When I was in high school, there was this girl who was really mean to Cindy. I mean, Cindy was kind of a nerd, and this girl thought it was her purpose in life to tell her every day how much everyone hated her. She sounds pleasant. Oh, she was. Her name was Melissa. She had perfect flowing blonde hair and thought she was God's gift to the human race. Couldn't stand her. Cissie shook her head, her ponytail flying back and forth. So anyway, she was dating this guy, who just so happened to be playing the lead opposite me in our school's production of 7 Brides for 7 Brothers. We were constantly together for rehearsals. Well, you would be. Did you like him? Bob asked. Not really. He was a jerk and really deserved her. Anyway, I got sick of how she was treating Cindy, so I decided to do something about it. I started flirting with him as much as possible during rehearsal. What was his name? Steve. So, anyway, he started to like me. A lot. And I put everything I had into every one of those practice kisses. She grinned at him. And I told him if he'd break up with Melissa, I'd rock his world. At the time she'd thought about playing rock music for him in the hall, or even giving him a rock she'd drawn eyes, nose, horns, and maybe a mustache onto. But a handlebar mustache, of course, because everyone knows rocks only have handlebar mustaches. And did you rock his world? She nodded. So he broke up with her the next day. I led him over in front of her locker and made sure she saw us kissing. For 3 days before school and after school, we kissed in front of her locker. At lunchtime, we made sure to sit close to the table she shared with her friends. That's mean, but it sounds justified. Yeah, but right after the play, when I knew I wouldn't be spending hours with him every day anymore, I made sure we sat with her at lunch, and I told her what I'd done and why. Then I told Steve to find a real girlfriend. I got up and walked away. I don't regret what I did to Melissa, but Steve had never been anything but nice to me. He was a jerk to other people, and ended up dropping out of school when he got a girl pregnant, but none of that was stuff he did to me. She shrugged. I should have found a way to hurt her without using someone else. Bob nodded. High school girls do mean things sometimes. It's just what they do. Kids are the cruelest people around. Cissie nodded. Your turn. Bob considered. Sometimes I regret becoming a cop. I love what I do, but sometimes I'm not sure if I'm cut out for it. You know? He'd never said the words aloud before. He'd always at least pretended to be happy with his vocation. Before Chainaid, he'd loved what he did. Now, he wasn't so certain any longer. Cissie moved her swing closer to his, capturing the chains from his in her hands as she kissed him softly. Make me a promise, Deputy Bob? He caught her by the waist, pulling her up against him. What's that? If you decide to stop being a cop, will you make sure you keep the uniform? Her hands went inside his coat to stroke his chest. I kind of like it. So let me get this straight. You don't care if I do the job associated with the uniform as long as I wear it? The woman had lost her ever-loving mind, but he wasn't surprised. She was happy with him, so she couldn't be right in the head. Well, of course not. At least you're honest with me. And all I ask in return is total and complete honesty. Simple, huh? She waited to see if he'd tell her what he was dreaming about, but when he didn't, she said, I hope you know I won't leave you because of anything you might tell me. Bob frowned, not responding. She wanted to know about the dreams, and he wasn't ready to tell her. Someday she'd know everything, but by then, he hoped she would love him. Only love would keep them together. Cissie sighed, knowing her efforts had failed. Again. Asterisk. When he started twitching in his sleep again that night, Cissie stroked his shoulder and kissed him softly, trying to calm him. When he woke, she could see the fear in his eyes. You shouldn't touch me when I'm dreaming like that. What if he accidentally knocked her to the floor? He was strong. He worked out every day. He didn't want to risk her like that. Cissie shrugged. Why? Do you think you'll hurt me? Are they violent dreams? He sighed, scrubbing his hand over his face. Stop pushing, okay? He got out of bed and stalked to the bathroom, slamming the door behind him. She heard the shower running and sighed. Well, that didn't go well, she mumbled, getting out of bed and changing the sheets again. This time she took all the sheets from the hamper and carried them into the basement, throwing them into the washer. If she put them in the dryer before leaving for work, they'd have clean sheets for the next night. When she'd first seen his linen closet, she'd been surprised at the number of sheet sets he had. Now she understood. He only had a few days' worth. She couldn't figure out what had happened. For a week he'd been fine, and then suddenly the dreams had started. Obviously, he'd been through them before. She just wished she could understand what caused them. She had just laid back down when he came out of the bathroom, a towel still in his hands. Thanks for changing the sheets again. Cissie nodded slowly. She hadn't realized he'd noticed her changing them even once. Are you sure you don't want to talk about it? I'm a good listener. He shook his head. Not yet. I'm not ready. He wasn't sure if he ever would be. She nodded, reaching for him. Am I allowed to at least be close to you after one of your dreams? I feel like you keep pushing me away. Bob closed his eyes for a moment before turning to her and holding her close. I'd like that a lot. He didn't feel like he deserved to be comforted, but he'd take it. He needed it. Cissie buried her face in his neck, smelling the soap he'd just used. She hated he went through this every night, and wished with everything inside her she could help him. Already she was falling for him, but she knew she couldn't completely relinquish her heart until he trusted her. Whenever that might be. Chapter 8. When Bob walked into the bowling alley just before 6 the following evening, he slid into a booth across from Trey and Cindy. Where's Cissie? He knew he wasn't too late to hear her opening song, but he didn't see her anywhere. She's getting drinks and snacks, Cindy told him. Are you two all right? Bob nodded, closing his eyes for a moment. I think she's forgiven me for deceiving her. He really hated that Cindy knew about what had happened between them. Cindy grinned. Cissie never could hold a grudge. Me? You get on my bad side, and I never forget it. She leaned forward. So don't mess with my friend again, or I will have to remove choice parts of your body with a dull, rusty blade. Understand? Bob nodded slowly. I understand. He wished he didn't. Trey looked at Cindy, pulling her closer. So glad you love me. You're kind of scary sometimes. Cindy glared at him. Same goes for you, too. You mess with Cissie again, I hurt you. Trey nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. Cissie came back to the booth, then with a big tray. She dropped a basket of cheese curds on the table, along with 4 burgers and drinks for everyone. Taking the tray back, she rushed off again. Cindy distributed the burgers as if nothing had happened. Are you going to sing tonight? She asked Bob. Bob shook his head. I don't sing. The very thought of getting up in front of everyone and singing was petrifying for him. Not at all? 'Cause Cissie would love that. I know she would. Bob watched as Cissie slid into the booth beside him, kissing him immediately. You should come see my office after I sing, she whispered softly. He raised an eyebrow. Your office? Why? What was she thinking? He was almost afraid to find out. 'Cause you look so good in that uniform, it makes me want to take it off you. She turned and took a bite of her burger. Cindy reached for a cheese curd. What are you going to sing tonight? It's a surprise. Cissie had been thinking about what to sing all week. She wanted to do something special for Bob. Less than 10 minutes later, she left her burger half-eaten and went to the stage, speaking softly to the karaoke hostess who nodded and smiled. Bob waited for the woman to introduce her as usual, but instead Cissie took the microphone. I want to dedicate this song to my awesome new husband, Deputy Bob Anderson. Don't call him Deputy Bob, though. He doesn't like that, she said in a mock whisper. It truly is the sweetest thing I've ever known. As she swayed to the music, she watched him, and once she started singing, her eyes were on his. She'd been humming this song all day, keeping her voice limber so she could sing to him. Bob felt his heart leap. It had been one thing to hear her powerful voice before he knew her. Now that she was his wife, it affected him more than he could say. He felt humbled that she sang for him, and she made it so clear she was singing just to him. When she was finished, she got the loud applause she always got, before she hurried back to the table. She slid into the booth beside Bob, kissing him softly, knowing all the eyes in the room were on her. You make me feel like I'm someone special, you know that, Cissie? Bob's voice caught as he whispered the words to her. How could she put up with him when she was so incredible? You are. Trust me on this. She laid her head on his shoulder for just a moment before turning back to her food. Cindy rolled her eyes. Get a room. Cissie laughed. Trey said you need to learn some new moves, so I was just helping out. She may have forgiven Trey, but that didn't mean she wouldn't try to get him in trouble as much as possible. Trey sputtered. I never said any such thing. I wouldn't. Cissie looked at him. And who do you think she's going to believe? The best friend she's known for 20 years, or some freak she met at the altar in July? Cindy bit her lip, holding back a laugh. The freak she met at the altar in July, of course. Turning toward Bob, Cissie asked, Didn't you want to see my office? You cannot do your new husband in your office, Cissie Rivers. It's just wrong. Cindy protested. Cissie glared at Cindy. It's Cissie Anderson now, thank you very much. She slid out of the booth and waited for Bob to follow, heading to her office with him. Once they were there, she turned to him. We can't really make love to each other in this office. My dad would be able to sense it when he came in tomorrow night, but we can make out and freak Cindy out. Bob laughed, gripping her waist and pulling her to him. That works for me. He brought his lips to hers, kissing her slowly and thoroughly. Thank you for the tribute. It meant the world to me. Cissie sat on the edge of her desk, her hands on his shoulders. I meant every word. I could tell. He wanted to tell her that he didn't deserve her affection, but he couldn't. He had never wanted anything in life as much as he wanted her to love him, and he wasn't going to give it up for anything. She smiled at him, stroking his cheek. You're pretty terrific, Bob Anderson. He lowered his head again, and she twined her fingers through his hair. He moved closer, pressing against her. I want to make love to you. His voice was urgent as his lips played with hers. Cissie was tempted by the idea. Just as she opened her mouth to agree, there was a loud knock on the door. It opened immediately. Excuse me, Cissie, the voice stopped. Oh crap. Sorry, boss lady. The door closed again. Cissie chuckled, burying her face in Bob's neck. This is probably not the time. She scooted off the desk and opened the door. You need something? There's someone on the phone who wants to do a party here, Jason, the boy who was in charge on Wednesday nights said. I can have her call back. Cissie shook her head. No, I'll take the call. She looked over her shoulder at Bob, who had followed her out. His hair was mussed, and she grinned. He looked funny in his perfectly pressed deputy uniform, with his hair sticking up every which way. We'll finish at home. She waggled her brows at him. Jason was blushing beet red. I'm so sorry. You were doing your job, Jason. It's perfectly fine. Bob and I just got a little carried away. We are newlyweds after all. Cissie knew she should probably be embarrassed about being caught in the office kissing, but she wasn't. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She was married. Jason had taken a year off before college, saving money so he wouldn't have to take out a student loan. He worked 40 hours per week for Cissie, doing a lot of the managerial work Cissie couldn't get to on her own. "Well, I'm sorry." Cissie patted him as she walked to the phone. Bob watched her go. "It's me you should be apologizing to," Bob said with a slight grin. "I was about to be very happy in my wife's office." He watched her bottom swaying in her jeans as she walked off. He was just glad he'd have a rain check. Jason laughed, feeling more comfortable now that his boss was out of earshot. "She's pretty incredible. All the guys have a crush on her." "Even you?" Bob asked, one brow rising. Jason shook his head. "No, sir. She's more of a sister type to me." "Glad to hear it." Bob walked back across the bowling alley to where Cindy and Trey were waiting. He couldn't believe he felt jealous of a teenage boy over his own wife. Cindy took one look at his mussed-up hair and groaned. "You two couldn't control your urges until you got home? You're like a couple of hormonal teenagers." Bob laughed. "As it happens, we were interrupted, but I'd almost convinced her that the desk in her office was the perfect place." He didn't care where anymore. She'd convince him to use the back of his patrol car soon. He was barely putting up a fight anymore. Trey shook his head at Bob. "You quit blushing, I see." Bob shrugged. "Yeah, and I figured out how to talk to her too. Amazing what propinquity will do for you." Cissie slid into the booth beside Bob. "Did you miss me?" Bob put his arm around her, kissing her forehead. "I did, but Trey said mean things about you." Cissie glared at Trey. "Why would you do that?" Trey looked at Cindy. "They're going to do this to me all night, aren't they?" "Looks like it," Cindy said with a grin. "You deserve it." Trey sighed. "Probably." Asterisk. As soon as they got inside the house that night, Cissie shut and locked the door, her hands going to his shirt. "Time to get all your clothes off, Deputy Bob." "Oh, really? Am I dirty? Do I need a shower?" "You'll need one in an hour." "I promise." She nipped his ear with her teeth. Asterisk. That night when he woke with his dreams, he laid there for a moment, trying to still his racing heart. He looked over at Cissie, who was watching him calmly. "I'll help if I can." He rolled out of bed and went into the bathroom without another word. That night, she'd stood over him watching as he'd shot the perp and seen Cheney die. Her eyes had blamed him for everything. Asterisk. Bob waited to call his former shrink until he was on his way to work. "We've got to get these dreams to stop." 4 nights in a row. "It hasn't been this bad since before Tanya lft me. And now my wife is in the dreams. She's watching me in the store, and she's blaming me. You need to tell your wife what's happening. I think you were crazy not to tell her before you married. The woman has a right to know." "We met at the altar," Bob told him, waiting for the shock he knew he'd get. Dr. Daly knew him like no one else. He knew he wouldn't need to resort to a matchmaker to marry. There was silence from the other end of the phone as Dr. Daly worked that out in his head. "What do you mean you met at the altar? People don't do that anymore, you know. They haven't for at least 100 years." Bob briefly explained about matrimony and how it worked. "So we met at the altar. That's crazy. But I can see the benefits if you can't find someone any other way." Dr. Daly sighed. "Obviously you care about her though." "More than I can say." Bob couldn't imagine a wife who would be more right for him than Cissie was. "Then tell her. Tonight, this weekend, whenever. But tell her soon. The longer you keep something like that from her, the longer there's going to be friction in your marriage." "All right." Bob had no desire to tell Cissie anything, but he could see the value of Dr. Daly's words. "I'll do it." Saying the words instantly brought him both relief and fear. Relief that she'd know, but fear that she'd leave. Could he live with himself if she didn't stay? Good. And Bob? Yeah? It sounds like you found a good woman this time. Congratulations. Bob smiled to himself as he pulled into the sheriff's parking lot. Thanks. I did. Asterisk. On his way home that night, Bob was still thinking about what Dr. Daly had said. He needed to tell Cissie, and he was going to take a page from her book. She said it was better to just rip the bandage off and go on, so that's what he'd do. He turned the radio on and did his car dance quickly before going into the house. Every day he worked, at least once, he car danced in honor of his lost partner. He felt her presence as he did it, knowing she would approve. When he got home, he changed into jeans and a casual shirt. He didn't want Cissie to get distracted by his uniform again. She had a one-track mind about some things. Not that he was complaining. She was exactly what he needed. He just hoped he could continue to be what she needed. When Cissie walked in, she saw Bob waiting for her on the couch, and she raised an eyebrow. What, no dinner? Is it not a good night for spoiling Cissie? We need to talk, Bob told her, patting the spot beside him on the couch. All at once, Cissie's smile left her face and her hunger disappeared. What are we talking about? She asked, taking the seat beside him and leaning over to kiss him quickly on the lips. He took a deep breath. This is a tough subject for me, so I want you to listen without interrupting. When I'm done with my story, you can ask any questions you need to ask. Cissie nodded, her attention focused entirely on her husband. She hoped he was going to talk about whatever it was that had been bothering him so much. I'm ready. Let me start by saying, I loved being a cop. I went to the academy right after college, and nothing made me happier. I wore my badge with pride and quickly was given the task of training rookies. He scrubbed his hands through his hair, looking down at the floor. My second rookie was a young girl named Chainade. You actually remind me of her. She was full of life. She thought we should play the radio loudly in the car so she could car dance all the time. I wouldn't let her very often, because then I couldn't hear dispatch over the radio. He drew a deep breath. One day in late January, we were on our way to dinner, and she'd talked me into letting her listen to music. She was car dancing like a crazy woman, and I saw people in a couple of other cars look over at us. We must have looked crazy. I was this straight-laced white cop, and she was this young black woman, bobbing up and down and doing all these hand motions. I pointed out how we looked, and she suggested we turn the music up louder and open the windows so they could hear, because she was convinced anyone hearing that music would be forced to dance with her. Cissie smiled at that. Chainade did sound like her. While she was car dancing and I was driving merrily to the diner of our choice, we got a call on the radio for any available units. There was a robbery at a convenience store we'd just passed, so she turned down the music and gave our location, and I whipped a U-turn and headed back toward the store. We were the first unit on the scene, and I told her to wait for me before jumping out of the car, but she was young and hard-headed, and she ran inside, leaving her car door open. She hadn't even drawn her gun yet. She knew better. I'd read her the riot act for not having her gun at the ready more times than I could count by then. He stood up and started pacing as he talked. He was obviously upset, and Cissie wanted to get up and hold him, but she'd promised to be quiet, so she was. I ran after her, but was a few seconds behind, which seemed to always happen. I thought of her as a younger sister, and I felt like it was my job to protect her, something she never let me do, of course. He stopped pacing for a moment and looked at her. Life is so fragile. You never know when someone you love is going to die, and you'll never get to see them again. Never get to tell them what they meant to you. It was all Cissie could do not to get up off the couch and run to him, but she knew he needed to finish his story without any interruptions. So I ran after her into the store, just in time to see her throw her body over a little girl who was crying. The perp lifted his gun and shot. He said something about warning the little girl to stop crying first, but it was too quick. He shot Sinead. I didn't take the time to look. I shot him twice, in the chest. I knew he was dead. He sucked in a breath. It's the only time I've ever killed anyone, and it was hard, but I'd do it again and again if I could bring her back. Cissie closed her eyes, feeling his pain. Che was gone before I could do anything. The little girl was still crying. Her mom had been shot, was unconscious, but they both lived. But not Che. She was one of those special people, the kind that makes everyone around them happy just by living. Someone like you. His breathing was ragged, like he'd been crying, but his eyes were dry. I spent the rest of the night being questioned by the chief and then the department shrink. That's what happens when you shoot someone. Or your partner dies. Hopefully never both on the same night. Oh, Bob. I'm sorry. Cissie got up and ran to him, throwing her arms around him and holding him tight. She had tears streaming down her face. Bob buried his face in her hair. He had to finish it, or he'd never be able to. So I went home that night, and Tanya was mad, because I'd forgotten to call. She told me my job was always more important than her. That she always came last. It wasn't true. It was never true. She never mattered as much as you do, though. He moved back to the couch, keeping an arm around her the whole way. So the nightmares started immediately. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, yelling for her. Telling her not to go into the store without me. To wait for me. He looked at her. Is that what you've experienced? She nodded. It is. After a month of that, Tanya told me she wasn't going to spend the rest of her life with a broken man, so if I couldn't get it together, and do it quickly, there was no place for me in her life. She was gone within 2 months of the shooting. He shrugged. At first, I didn't even know how to respond. I was seeing the department shrink. He'd put me on a leave of absence because I was taking it so hard. Sinead's parents kept in touch with me, talking over and over about how much they appreciated that I'd avenged her death. You did the right thing, killing him, you know. Bob nodded. I do know that, but I wish there'd been some other way. I wish I could have taken him in and made him suffer for the rest of his life for what he did to her. That little girl sends me a Christmas card every year. And every year she thanks me for saving her and her mommy. And every year, it breaks my heart, because I wasn't thinking about her and her mommy when I shot him. I was thinking about my partner, and how she'd never car dance again. How she'd never marry the boy whose ring she wore. How she'd never have the 3.7 children she always talked about. He shook his head. I killed him because I wanted him dead. I could easily have shot the gun out of his hand, but I didn't. Cissie wondered if anyone had ever told him he'd done the right thing and held him since the shooting. There was Bob, tough for everyone else, but no one was tough for him. You want to know what I think? Bob looked at her face, really looked at her for the first time since he'd started his story. Her face was covered with tears. I do. I think Tanya should be, I'd say shot, but that would be terribly insensitive. Something awful should happen to her. Maybe she should be put in a pit filled with rattlesnakes. Or we could drag her behind a car. Or, I can think of a number of things I'd like to do to that witch. And I do mean witch with a capital B. She shook her head. You did your job, and you did the right thing. You're a good man. Of course, you have nightmares about it still. Why wouldn't you? She shook her head. Tanya should have held you after it happened. She should have told you she still loved you, because you're a wonderful, lovable person, Bob. Would you mind giving me her address? Please? Bob gave a half laugh, dragging her against him. You are 10 times the woman Tanya was. She did me a favor, and I can see that now. If she hadn't left, I'd have been stuck with her, but I know now I never loved her. How could I love her when my heart has been waiting for you for all this time? Cissie buried her face in his shoulder, happy to be in his arms. Happy to feel at home. Finally, she understood what he'd been hiding, and it hadn't been a terrible thing. Why didn't you want to tell me what happened? She asked. That was the one thing she couldn't understand. Because I was afraid you'd leave, like Tanya did. I thought that somehow I was defective. He rested his cheek on the top of her head. I thought it was my fault it happened. How on earth could you blame yourself? You told her to stay in the car, right? Cissie couldn't believe what she was hearing. Yes, but you ran after her as fast as you could, right? He nodded. Then you did what you could. You are not at fault. The only one at fault that day is the man who was holding up the convenience store. She stroked his cheek. You have to believe me when I say that. It's not your fault. If she did nothing else in her life, she had to convince him of that. I'll try. What did the department shrink say about fault? She asked softly. He said I need to quit blaming myself. Bob sighed. He also said the nightmares would keep escalating until I told you. I didn't want to tell you, Cissie. I know you didn't, but I'm glad you did. How can I help you heal if I don't know you're injured? How are you going to help me heal anyway? He asked, confused. I'll have to kiss all of your boo-boos, of course. Bob grinned. That just might help. Asterisk. They had dinner out that night, neither of them feeling like cooking. When they got home, Cissie hugged Bob tightly. Thank you for telling me what you did. I knew you were hiding something, and I was falling in love with you, and it was about to kill me. I couldn't love a man I couldn't trust, but I couldn't trust a man who couldn't trust me. Am I making any kind of sense at all? Bob nodded. You are. I do love you, Cissie. Cissie smiled. I know. I love you, too. She stood on tiptoes, kissing him softly. He pulled her even closer. I was afraid you'd never say that to me. We got off to a rocky start, thanks to my secrets. We did. Next time you marry a random stranger, you should be more honest about stuff from the beginning. It'll make things easier for you. Bob just glared at her. Now why would I ever do that again? I'm married to the woman I love, who just said she loves me back. There's no way I'm going through that again. Going through that? Cissie asked in mock anger. Are you kidding me? You make me sound like some huge ordeal you just had to live through. He laughed. Well, you were a bit difficult to deal with. I mean, how many virgin brides are practically stripping their husbands while they're still in the church? Oh, quit bragging. You know you loved it. Bob laughed. I love everything about you, Cissie Anderson. Epilogue. Bob stomped the snow off his shoes before he opened the door to the house, finding Cissie curled up under a quilt on the couch. You're home early. Are you sick? Cissie smiled up at him as he leaned down to kiss her before she even answered. That's what being married was all about. Not caring if the other person was sick and kissing them anyway. No, I took the day off today so I could go to the doctor, remember? I told you I was going to. He nodded. Yeah, I remember. They'd been married over a year, and were about to celebrate their second Christmas together. His nightmares still came, but they were getting further and further apart. How'd it go? Cissie smiled. Well, it looks like Cindy's little girl is going to have a friend. You mean? I do mean. I took a test a couple of days ago, but I just wanted to be certain before I told you. We're having our own in about 7 months. He sat down beside her, almost afraid to touch her. Are you happy about it? I know you always said you didn't really want a baby. She shrugged. I think I am. I'm having a really hard time with morning sickness, and I'm not sure why they call it morning sickness, because it's starting when I get up and going until I go to bed. Are you going to be okay? Yes, I'll be fine, but the doctor doesn't want me working a lot of hours until my stomach calms. Jason is going to take over as manager for a while. I'll go in at least a couple of times a week so I can monitor him, but he's going to run things. Wow. I can go back to day shift. She laughed. I know how much you hate nights. Yeah, go back to days. And I may not go back to working any more than a couple of hours twice a week. I may just decide to be a stay-at-home mom. Just so long as you don't abandon your karaoke fans. She laughed. I think they'd survive if I did. Have you told Cindy? She shook her head. I wanted you to know first. I'll tell her tomorrow when we meet for lunch. Cindy was 6 months along, and she was craving everything bad for her. Fried cheese curds and root beer were just what she wanted. I'm coming too. Of course. You're going to be a wonderful father, Deputy Bob. What do you want to name him? Cissie glared at him. He's a she. We're naming him Roberta, Bobby for short. Bob groaned. I have 7 months to talk you out of that. You can try.